ever seen people reading and enjoying a fantasy book, talking about how they were transported into a whole other world and you want to experience it for yourself, but you just don't know what to expect from the fantasy genre, where to start with the fantasy genre, and which books you can pick up as a fantasy genre beginner? Then this video is perfect for you, because I'm going to tell you how you can start reading fantasy books as a beginner. Hey you guys, welcome back to the channel. I hope you're doing very nice, and I'm sending a lot of hugs and positivity to all of you. Hi, if you're new, welcome to the channel. I really hope you enjoy the content, and if you do, please do consider subscribing. This is a complete fantasy genre guide for beginners if you've never read any fantasy book before. In the first part of the video, I will let you know some tips and what to expect when you get into the fantasy genre, so that you are not completely startled by, hey wait, what is going on? Because sometimes when we manage our expectations of a genre, it is easier to slide into it. And in the second part of the video, I will recommend a few books that I have started it and which I think are beginner friendly, so you can start with them too. So without any further ado, let's begin the video. The first point you need to remember when you get into the fantasy world, this is the most important point, which is world building. Fantasy world is a world created completely from scratch. There are sub-genres, subcategories in fantasy that can be based in the real world, but even then there are magic systems that are created from scratch. There is something like world building in these books, where the author informs us about what happens in these worlds, the geography of the world, the politics of the world, the history of the world sometimes if it is relevant to the story, how the characters are made up, what is the magic system in that book. A lot of people may end up having a very lovely relationship with world building. Seeing a world built from scratch is just such a beautiful experience, and a lot of people may hate the world building part because it's just so much information sometimes that your brain is not able to process it as fast as, for example, the romance genre or the thriller genre. Most of the times, good fantasy books do not make the world building very difficult for you to digest. It does not feel like a lot of information, but you just have to be prepared for a lot of information. If you do invest yourself into it, after the world building is done, there's only amazingness. Which brings me to point number 2. The names and the words used in fantasy novels are sometimes they can give you headaches. For example, when I was reading the Six of Crows duology, and I am myself a beginner in the fantasy world, certain words and certain names, they just would come over here in my brain, and then it wouldn't get processed. Please know that that is completely normal, and I think that even if you are a very seasoned fantasy reader, even if you have read a lot of fantasy books, at the end of the day you will read some fantasy book with the names and the words, the buildings, everything. It will be hard to pronounce, and that is completely fine. You have 3 ways to go. 1, just skip over it. Sometimes when the word is not very important to me, and this, I don't know if I should be guilty about it or not, it just sounds like blah in my head, and I just move past it, because if the story is really interesting, I am not going to stop and see the pronunciation. The second thing you can do is to stop and see the pronunciation on Google, the meaning of the word on Google, because fantasy worlds are such huge worlds. There is somebody out there who has uploaded how to pronounce a certain word and what it means. And the third, which is the best thing you can do, which I always prefer, is listen to it as an audiobook, because all of the words and names are pronounced properly. In an audiobook, it becomes even more interesting to listen to the entire fantasy book, and it helps you with the words and the names. Bringing me to the third point, 100 to 200 pages of a fantasy book are usually the most difficult pages to get through. When I say most difficult, it's not that hard, okay? It's not that hard. But if you're a beginner and you've read the romance genre and the thriller genre, and you quickly get what the story is about from like page 1, and then you go into the fantasy genre and you don't understand anything for like 50-60 pages because you have no idea what these people are talking about, it can be very intimidating, and it can also put you in a reading slump because you just don't care about what is going on. That again is completely completely normal. Even when you become a seasoned fantasy reader, the first 70 to 100 pages that include all of these new names and words, that include all of this world building, it is hard for us to get acclimated to it, to get used to it. And so if you already know that the first 100 to 200 pages are just going to be difficult, and that is completely fine, because at the end of the day everything will suddenly click and it will become this wonderful world for you, then you will actually enjoy reading those 100 to 200 pages. And that brings me to the fourth point, which is fantasy novels are usually this difficult to get into, or the first 100 to 100 pages can be troubling because they are usually part of a series. It starts from a duology, which is 2 books, and it can go up to 10 books in one series. So when the author is trying to build up a world that they're going to stretch for like 10 books, obviously the first 100 to 200 pages is going to be a little bit confusing. However, there are some books that are standalone in fantasy books too, and you can start with them. Do not buy the entire series at once. Buy the first book of the series, read the world, read the characters, see if the plot itself is enticing to you, is interesting for you. And if it is interesting, if you really want to know what happens ahead, and if you are okay with the world, you find the world interesting, you find the politics of it interesting, if you find the magic of it interesting, then go ahead and buy the next few books. I am the kind of person who likes to have all of the books at once because I love binging a series. I just love binging anything in general, but that has backfired for me sometimes, where I buy the entire series and I couldn't care less about the entire world or about the characters from the first book, and so the entire series is just a waste. And so because I have spent money, I force myself to read the entire series, but it's such a waste of time and it has put me in a reading slump. And so now I'm trying to become the kind of person who buys only the first book of a series to see if it is something that will entice me or not, and then go ahead and buy the other parts of the book. Along with that, it can be such a pro to have so many books in one series sometimes when you do enjoy the first book, because you are so attached to the characters, you are so attached to the world, you want to be with them for a long time, you want to spend time with them in the world, and you get to do that for a very, very long time. The relationship that you build with characters and the world in the fantasy genre is different from anything else because you just spend so much time with them, which brings me to the next point. The fantasy genre is not as easy as the romance genre or the thriller genre, where you just read the book and you can move on from it. It is a complete world. It can definitely change your life, if not in the most inspiring self-help way where, oh, it will tell you to wake up early or something like that. It will show you just how beautiful this world can be if you wanted to. You will know that there is a beautiful world that exists, and once something like that enters your mind, you just can't get over it. You change as a person, you become a part of that fantasy world, and that fantasy world, those characters become a part of your soul. All of these points that indicated that it takes time to get into a fantasy world, oh, there is world building and this and that, there is so much investment that goes into the fantasy world, but the return is so worth it. You will not stop thinking about the characters if you get the most perfect fantasy book for yourself. You will not stop wanting to live in the world where those characters live, and it may change how you live your own life, because you may adopt a few things from your favorite characters. Maybe you become a braver person, maybe you become a more courageous person, because the character that you have read about started from a place where they were like so scared of everything going on in their life, but after 8 books you see them becoming the king and the queen and whatnot, and you're just like, you know what, I can do it because they are my favorite characters and I'm taking inspiration from them. Which brings me to the next point. Fantasy in itself is peak fiction, it is peak art, it is peak imagination. There are worlds built from scratch, and sometimes there are elements in the book that you will never find in the real world. For example, when I was reading the Avatar series, there is this concept of a pond or a river of starlight. So it does not have water in it, it has starlight in it, and obviously you will never see that in the real world. But the way it was described in this fantasy book, the way it paints a picture and it is so descriptive, I felt like I was actually in that pond or river of starlight, and that is the most beautiful thing ever. How does one imagine that? And then these huge magic systems. I heard it somewhere, I think someone really popular said it, that art is not meant to be understood, it is meant to be felt. And that is what fantasy genre does to you. You read those things, and even though they don't exist in the real world, they are completely fictitious. You feel them, and you feel them in a way like you don't feel any logical thing. The next point is that fantasy has a lot of elements of politics and magic and wars, and if it is a high stake fantasy, then it is like a life and death situation, or two countries are at war, something like that is usually going on. If you don't like the politics and war side of it, then you can try another subgenre in fantasy, which I will talk to you about in a minute. Before that, let me express this. I have stayed away from the fantasy genre for a very long time. I actually used to make fun of my brother and my best friend Jane because they were so invested in the fantasy genre as a teenager, and I never read fantasy as a teenager because I was like, that is not the real world. Read something that is based in the real world. Literary fiction is one of my most favorite genres because I just love to experience different human lives, different human emotions without having to go through those things myself, because books can capture that and books make you so empathetic. I thought that the fantasy genre cannot do that, but I couldn't be further away from the truth. I couldn't be more wrong. I have read a few fantasy books that have inspired so much bravery and courage in me, the way that no non-fiction, no self-help book can. It has gotten so close to history, even though history is equal to boredom in my head. That's how my brain is programmed. I have read a few of these fantasy books and been like, hey, let me just see what the inspiration, the historical inspiration is behind the story, and learn the entire history of it, because it just suddenly becomes so interesting. Fantasy genre can inspire you, it can educate you, and it can give you this beautiful art, whatever you want from it, in the most beautiful, enjoyable, entertaining way. Which brings me to the last point. Fantasy genre is divided into multiple subgenres. You have high fantasy, you have cozy fantasy, you have urban fantasy, romance fantasy, you have magical realism, you have mythology. I count mythology as fantasy. You have dark fantasy, you have historical fantasy, there is dystopian fantasy. These are the subcategories that I know about and that I have, I think, read. But it just becomes deeper and deeper. As I said, fantasy world, a huge world. High fantasy is when the entire world is built from scratch, or the entire magic system is built from scratch and everything is fantastical. Whereas low fantasy is when maybe it is set up in the real world itself. Then we have high stakes and low stakes. High stakes is usually when there is war, or when there is a life and death situation, or basically the stakes are so high that you're like, oh my god, oh my god, oh my god, what is going to happen? And then we have cozy fantasy, where your adrenaline is really, really low, it's pumping low, because even if it is a fantasy world, high fantasy world is just so cozy, and it talks about such cozy topics, and it's not a life and death situation, it's just a really nice time. Urban fantasy is a fantasy that is set up in the real world, in cities, in urban cities. Dark and grim fantasy is what it says. It can be very graphic, it can be very gruesome, it is sad, it is heartbreaking. Then we have romance fantasy, which is one of my most favorite genres, because the romance in the romance fantasies is peak romance. Enemies to lovers in the fantasy world is so different from enemies to lovers in the real world, and you read enemies to lovers in a fantasy world and realize this is what I wanted. You forget all of the tiny bickering that us normal human beings have in normal books, and you just want to read enemies to lovers in the romance fantasy genre. We have historical fantasy, where either the entire story is set up in historical times, or it is based and inspired by history. We have mythology, which is a genre in its own, but I count it as fantasy too. So we have Greek mythology, we have Roman mythology, we have Indian mythology, we have Norse mythology, and in the end we have dystopian fantasy. And I have not read a lot of dystopian books, so I don't know if this definition is correct, so please do Google it. But what I think dystopian is is an alternative of the real world, a reimagination of the real world. The systems and the government and the rules that human beings live by are different. I hope all of that was computable. Now let's move on to some book recommendations. There are a few videos that I have already made which have some authors and some categories that come under the fantasy genre, and it has book recommendations in them. It has what you can keep in mind and what you can expect in them as a beginner. I have a Murakami beginner's guide, which is recommendation of Murakami books and what you can expect when you get into the Murakami world, because he is one of the best magical realism writers, and if you watch that video you will also come to know what you can expect from the magical realism genre. I'll put the link in the description. We have a Greek mythology beginner's guide where I have told you what you can expect from the Greek mythology genre, and a few book recommendations for beginners. We have Paulo Coelho beginner's guide, which is what you can expect from Paulo Coelho book, and a few book recommendations. Now Paulo Coelho doesn't necessarily write complete like high fantasy, but it does have fantasy elements in it of a very different type, which you will come to know when you watch the Paulo Coelho video. I could talk about those books again over here, but it would just take too much time, and I think that this video is anyhow going to be long, so I will just leave it upon you to go ahead and watch that video because it is just way more descriptive and enjoyable. I'm gonna start with 3 books that I think you can read as a kid also, even if you're like 10, 11, 12 years old. And adults, it may be a little boring for you, but I have read these books as an adult and it has inspired me. It has reminded me what it is like to be a child and what matters when you're a child and how those things are like really pure and important. First up, we have The Girl Who Drank the Moon by Kelly Barnhill, which is the story of this province, this town that leaves one child in the forest because they think that the witch wants one child every year. The witch comes and takes the child, and the witch feeds the child star juice usually, but she feeds this child moon juice, because of which this child is now turned into this magical being, and you see the journey of that. It sounds weird, fine, and it sounds childish, but when you read the book it's actually really interesting, and as I said, it inspired the child in me. It made me remember how much magic there is in the real world, and it talks about some philosophies of like happiness and sorrow and whatnot in this magical, really easy language. So yes, it can be boring if you're an adult, but I would still say give it one shot. What if you do like it, if you like those books that is set from the perspective of a child? Then we have The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. Neil Gaiman is such a popular fantasy writer. He has written some characters from the Norse mythology and whatnot, which are so popular, and so many Netflix series and movies are inspired by these characters. I have only read this book. This is the story of this 2-year-old child who escaped a fire in his house, and he ends up at a graveyard, and the creatures in the graveyard adopt him, and they're like, we'll take care of you. You see the journey of that child. If you're a teenager or even a child, you will enjoy this book so much. And even though it was slightly boring for me, the creatures, it's the creatures. Neil Gaiman's creatures are amazing. They're so original, so thoughtful. I love it. And then we have The Giver by Lois Lowry, which is a dystopian fantasy novel. In this community, in this world, there is no war, there is no hunger, there is no poverty, there is no pain, and then there is this one receiver of memory who comes to know what the world was like before all of these things happened. When our main character becomes the receiver of memory, he comes to know about all of those things. It's a very thin book, and it was very interesting even as an adult for me, probably because it is dystopian. It is a reimagination of the real world, and once I was done reading this book, I was just so grateful to be a human being who can feel everything and who has art in this world, and I just realized there's just so much to enjoy as a human being. Next up, we have the entire Harry Potter series. Obviously, teenagers can also read it, adults can also read it. I think I read it as an adult, and this is usually everybody's like first fantasy series. It is high fantasy, it is high stake. There are 7 books in the Harry Potter series. It is the story of Harry Potter, whose parents were taken away when he was a child, and then he just lives his life as an orphan till one day when he comes to know that he can do magic, and then he is sent to a magic school. It sounds very weird. All fantasy plots just sound really weird, but when you get into it, you get so attached to all of the characters. There are 7 books to build a relationship with all of these characters, and they stay with you forever. It is so rich in emotion. I do not stand for everything that the author does, and I don't even want to take her name, but the art, the books, they are amazing, and you can definitely check them out as a beginner, as a teenager, as an adult. And with Harry Potter, we have the Percy Jackson series, which is a collection of 5 books. But if you love this series, if you love this world and the characters, which I think you will love these characters and this world, then there are many more books. I think it's 11 to 12 books in all. So the story that starts in the first book of this series, which is The Lightning Thief, gets over in this series itself, and then you just go ahead to see more of the life of these characters in the other books. It's not like this entire series will end off in a cliffhanger. I have not read all of these books. I have read the first 2 books, and that too I have read them when I was a teenager. And as I told you, I was not a fantasy reader when I was a teenager. Even then I read these books. Imagine how interesting they must have been. It's also inspired by Greek mythology, and it is the story of this one boy who is a demigod, and that is all I can tell you. His adventures. Teenagers, adults, read it. Talking about Indian mythology, we have the Shiva trilogy, which I have now recommended at least 1 million times because I loved it so much. The Immortals of Meluha, The Secret of the Nagas, and The Oath of the Vayuputras. It's the story of Shiva, who is living a normal life, just trying to love and protect his loved ones, but one day when their lives are threatened, he's looking for a solution, and while looking for the solution, he comes to know that, oh, I am the chosen one, I am the Nilkant, and now he has certain responsibilities which he has to fulfill. But will he fulfill them? Very short books comparatively, compared to like tons of like other fantasy books which are like really thick. Very easy language. And also, if you don't want to straight up go into complete fantasy where things don't really make sense sometimes, you can start with these books, because a lot of the fantasy mythological elements that you have heard about have been described in a scientific manner, so it becomes very logical, and so you're able to process it more. So if you are more of the scientific person who's like, oh, you know what, I need some sort of logic to believe the story, then I think you will enjoy this series. You can at least start with this series and then maybe move forward to series that are not complete science. The standalone we have is The Forest of Enchantments by Chitra Banerjee Devakarni, or even The Palace of Illusions by Chitra Banerjee Devakarni. That book is not really like my most favorite book, and so I don't talk about it much. You can read that though. It is the story of Draupadi from the epic Mahabharata. So it's said from the perspective of Draupadi. This is set from the perspective of Sita from the epic of Ramayana, and I love it. There is world building in this, but it is written so beautifully that you just love the world building. You love the character study, and you love Sita. Oh my god, teenagers can read these books too. Next up we have Threads That Bind. It is inspired by Greek mythology. I think the characters in this book are the descendants of the Greek gods, and this book is the story of the 3 fate sisters, mainly this one sister who can see the fate thread, and then one day she finds this thread that is attached to her fated lover, and you see what happens next. It is a YA fantasy, so you can read it even if you are a teenager. My only complaint with this book was the world building. The information part of it was quite heavy for such a small book. But there is a second book that is about to come out in, I think, June, and I'm hoping that that one is going to be amazing, because everything was properly built up and interesting by the end of this book. Next we have my most favorite genre in fantasy ever, the romance fantasy genre. I started my romance fantasy genre journey with The Wrath and Dawn and Rose and Dagger. I was in the deepest reading slump of my life, and then I read these books and I was like, oh, I love it. Basically, the main 2 characters of this book are supposed to kill each other, but they fall in love. That is all I'm going to tell you, and I think that is all you should know. The vibe is magnificent, and it is this old school kind of love that I love so much. It's so respectable, it's so beautiful. To read all of the quotations in this book, this one is more more romance heavy, and so this was my favorite book, because when I read this series, I was not really a fantasy reader. I did not know that fantasy involves a lot of politics and a lot of war. So this book has more of the politics and the war, which also is not heavy. The world building is not very heavy in these books. So I liked this one a little lesser, but now that I have read so many fantasy books and I know that politics and war are a part of it, I think when I reread this series, I will enjoy this one too. I think it's YA actually. Next up, we have the most beginner friendly fantasy book ever, which is Fourth Wing, and the second book in it, Iron Flame. It's the story of Vi, who wants to become a scribe, but her mother forces her to become a rider in the Fourth Wing, and she is not really built for it, but now we see how she survives. There are dragons in this book, and the reason I say that this is the best for fantasy beginners is because you read these books and it is a beautiful example of what the fantasy world can contain. The world building, the difficult names and words, the world built from scratch, dragons, magic systems. It has wars, it has politics, and obviously it has enemies to lovers romance in it. In this book, it is heavy. I have not finished this one, but it is still very heavy on the war and politics side of it, how much ever I have read. It is good when you read these books as a beginner, because if you read it after reading a lot of fantasy books, you realize that they are not really as good. So read it as a beginner, see what the fantasy world can be like, enjoy it because it is super exciting for sure, and then move on to reading even better fantasy worlds. Next, enemies to lovers forbidden romance, we have Powerless by Lauren Roberts. This is also YA, so you can read it as a teenager. It is the story of Pei and Kai. Pei is an ordinary, Kai is an elite who's supposed to kill ordinaries, but Pei is posing as an elite, and elites think that if there is any ordinary left in the world, then the elites will die because ordinaries are some sort of disease. The main thing in this particular book was the romance between Pei and Kai, and I've never read better enemies to lovers. I mean, obviously Wrath and Dawn was really good, but then you read this and you're like, whoa. The only bad thing about this book is that the second book is not out yet. It comes out in July, and I can't wait. In the end, in the romance fantasy genre, we have the entire ACOTAR series. Now this series also has a lot of war and politics going on in it, but I think it is majorly romance fantasy because the romance part of it is just like so huge. Usually there is romance in all of the fantasy books, but they're not major plots, and so they're not called romance fantasies. In this one, I think romance plays a huge role in everything. In ACOWAR, the war and the politics takes over and there's barely any romance, but apart from that, it's a lot of romance. It's a story of this girl who kills the wrong wolf, and then she's captured by a high fairy, which is a fantastical creature, and you will know what they do, what they don't do when you read the book. Now you see what she does as a human being in the Fae world. That is all I will tell you. Apart from that, super binge worthy. You forget the world exists. The world is beautiful. The world building is not that hard, even though it is done from scratch. Sarah J Maas is one of the most popular fantasy writers, and I think it is because she writes such beginner friendly books. Even if the worlds are so complicated, the magic is so complicated, and the characters are so deep, so you can read it as a beginner and fall in love with the fantasy genre. Next, we have cozy fantasy, where it is a high fantasy world, but the stakes are not very high. We have legends and lattes and bookshops and bone dust. In this, Viv, the main character, is trying to leave a world of violence and open up a coffee shop in a place that does not even know what coffee is. And in this one, we go back a little bit and we see what was going on when Viv was still in the world of violence. They're the coziest, best books ever, especially for a person like me when you are reading books about coffee, and I am the biggest coffee lover in the entire world. And then there is this book about books, which, do I have to say anything? It romanticizes coffee and books. The vibes are so extremely cozy. The stakes are not very high. You're just discovering the love for coffee and books. So if you want a cozy good time, you can read these books. Even if you're a teenager, you can read these books, and they're amazing. Legends and Lattes was one of my top reads for 2023. A complete 360 to high stakes. We have the Six of Crows duology and Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom, which is the story of 6 people from different backgrounds backgrounds coming together to take over a heist. That is all I can tell you, but it just gets so much deeper than that. Six of Crows duology, the highlight is the found family trope in it, where these 6 characters that are so different from each other come together and become each other's family, even though they are not bonded with each other by blood. It is just such a beautiful journey to see, and apart from that, the stakes are high. It's very adrenaline pumping. It's very binge worthy. Though I will recommend taking a break after reading this book and then reading this book after some time, because I read both of them together because I just could not stop after the cliffhanger of this book. But I did regret it a little bit. The best books ever when it comes to high fantasy, high stake. You won't understand the first 100-200 pages of this book because they're just so very difficult words, but it's worth it if you stick to it. In the end, we have a series, a dark fantasy, dark, grim, historical fantasy. We have the Poppy War trilogy. This is the story of Rin, who wants to escape marriage, and so she will do anything to escape marriage. So she gets into this school, because if she gets into that school, she does not have to be in her city and get married. And Rin is like this unhinged character. But you move ahead to see there is a war. That is all that I will tell you. It is heavily inspired by the Chinese history, and this is what I was talking about, because when I read these books, like, first of all, I did not even know about these things, and so it educated me, and second of all, I would never go and dive deep into the history of things if it was not for these books, because they are so heavily inspired by the history. I wanted to see what the actual history is like, what are the similarities, things like that. Let me warn you, this is extremely graphic, and it is extremely grim and dark. Oh god, it's just some pictures you can't remove from your brain once you have read this book. So it's not for the faint-hearted, obviously. The reason I recommend this even then as a beginner series, it's not for everybody, but if you are the kind of person who just loves the history of things, then you will really like this series. If you don't want to go into like books like Fourth Wing and stuff where it's dragons and whatnot, complete fantasy, then you will like this series. And I wanted to put in at least one series here for people like that who are more into the historical, informational side of things. You will love these series, but it's really dark. Obviously, it's based on the history of humankind. What else were you expecting? In the end, let me just talk about a few standalones. First up, we have the book that got me into the fantasy world, the first book I ever read, The Night Circus by Erin Mortonstone. I would not recommend this book to a complete beginner, because when I read it for the first time, it was a little slow for me, but I think that was because I did not know all of these things that I have already told you in this video. If I knew all of these things, then it would not be slow for me. And so I'm hoping that you will actually enjoy this book, because for the first 200-300 pages, the story is built up, and I was just pulling my hair out. I just remembered putting a story. Can someone please solve the mystery at this point, because I just can't. I seriously can't. But by the end of the book, it became such a beautiful book. It is so magical. It is so like a fairy tale. And there is a subplot of romance in this too, though I don't think that it is very heavy, and it is very dark. Next, we have The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, which is a historical fantasy book. It's the story of Addie LaRue, who has made a deal with somebody, because of which now she's going to live forever, but the return was that nobody will ever remember who she is. So it is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. This one also is a little bit of a slow read, but I don't think that it could be any faster than it was, or it could be any shorter than it was. Everything was very important to the story. It was a little repetitive here and there, but again, it was required to create the impact that the book did. It is beautiful. The writing is just gorgeous, and honestly, even though it is slow, it is quite binge worthy. Like, I read it in, I don't know how, like 1 or 2 days or something, because I just couldn't stop, and I did that while I was in a reading slump. So it is a beautiful book. It is a book that lets you know what it is like to be remembered and what it is like to be forgotten. So close to the human experience of just existing. It's not high fantasy, it's low fantasy. The fantasy elements are not that intense, so there's barely any world building going on. It's more about Addie LaRue, the character, so there's more of a character study in it. In the end, we have Study in Drowning by Ava Reed, which is the story of Effie, who actually wanted to be a literature student, but women are not allowed in the literature college, so she had to settle down for architecture. But one day she gets this job that as an architect she can design the house of her most favorite dead author author. So she thinks if she can just get close to the author, that is enough for her. But she discovers things about the author that she wished that she did not discover. As I have said at least a million times, how close fantasy can get to the real world, this book defines what it is like to be a woman in the academic world even now so beautifully. Everything that Effie goes through, oh my god, and the way she comes out of it. And then there is a very tiny subplot of romance in it. It is amazing. I love Effie. I loved the world. The world building is not very difficult, but it will take you like 20-30 pages to get into it. However, Effie is just such an amazing character that you will not want to stop. And with that, we come towards the end of the video. I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I really hope it was helpful. I have been wanting to make this video since so long, but I kept thinking, oh, I'll finish this one series and then I'll make it. No, I have made this video now. There are so many other series I want to read. I want to read the Mistborn trilogy. I want to read the Throne of Glass series. I want to read the Serpent and Dove trilogy, and I will read all of these, and I will make another video where I'm probably tier ranking all of these books or something like that. But for now, you have all of the tips you need to get into the fantasy world and a few books that you can start with. So go ahead, start your journey. I really hope you enjoyed. If you liked the video, please do give it a big fat thumbs up. Please do subscribe because it helps me a lot. I love you guys so much. Bye.